On a moonless night in 1968, a Viet Cong scout named Thon moved across an open field toward an American position. He was certain the darkness was absolute enough to hide him completely. A single shot found him from 300 meters away. There had been no moon. There had been no starlight worth mentioning, the sky thick with cloud, the kind of night Thon had crossed 100 times before without incident, because a night like that had always been the safest night there was. He had moved slowly, low, exactly as he had been trained, confident that no human eye on earth could have picked him out of that blackness. He was wrong, and he did not live long enough to understand why. Picture the last minutes of that crossing, because they were, by every measure Thon had ever learned, entirely ordinary. He paused at the tree line, watched the field for a long moment, listened for anything that might suggest the position ahead was more alert than usual. He heard nothing. He saw nothing. He judged the night correctly, by every rule that had ever kept him alive before, and he began to move. He was perhaps halfway across the open ground, moving the slow, careful crawl that had carried him safely through 100 nights like this one, when the shot came. There was no warning. There was no sound of a weapon being readied, no rustle, no cough, nothing at all to suggest that anyone in that position even knew he was there. And then he was simply gone, and the field was silent again, exactly as dark and exactly as empty as it had looked a moment before. The men in his unit who found out later from a survivor of that same patrol could not make sense of what had happened. They understood flares. They understood trip-wired lights. But this had been neither. No flash of illumination came before the shot. No warning gave the position away. Something in that American position had simply seen Thon in the pitch dark at long range, well enough to put a single round through him before he ever knew he had been spotted. Word of this spread through Viet Cong units the way any inexplicable danger spreads, quickly, with a dread worse for being impossible to plan around. Some assumed sorcery or luck or a trick they hadn't been told about yet. None of them, for a long stretch of the war, understood the actual answer. It was locked inside American equipment so secret that soldiers who carried it had to sign it out and account for its return, specifically so a captured one could never reach hands like theirs. That is the story of the rifle that let Americans see in the dark, and the scouts who paid for not understanding how. Now let me show you what was actually inside it. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why Than's death made no sense to the men who heard about it, you first have to understand exactly what the darkness actually contained. And you have to understand how one piece of glass and electronics learned to use it. To understand the fear this weapon produced, you first have to understand a fact about darkness itself that almost nobody on either side of that war had any reason to think about before this technology existed. What most people call total darkness is very rarely the complete absence of light. Even on a night with no visible moon, even under a sky thick with cloud, faint traces of light are still present, scattered from countless sources. Starlight filtering through haze, the last glow of a sun long since set below the horizon, the general, barely perceptible luminescence of a night sky that is never, in a strict physical sense, perfectly black. The human eye, remarkable as it is, simply cannot gather and use this trace amount of light. It evolved to see well enough to survive, not to detect the last handful of photons scattered across a jungle field on an overcast night. So, to a man like Than, moving through what appeared to be complete blackness, the darkness felt absolute. For the entire history of warfare up to that point, it effectively was. What changed and what killed Thon from 300 meters without warning was a device built to do exactly what the human eye could not: gather that faint, scattered light and make it visible. It worked through a technology called image intensification, and the principle behind it, once explained, is almost deceptively simple. Building a working version of it, small enough and reliable enough to mount on a rifle, was an extraordinary feat of the engineering of its era. A specially coated surface inside the device, called a photocathode, caught the tiny amount of ambient light entering the scope and converted it into a stream of electrons. Those electrons were then accelerated across a vacuum by a powerful electric charge, gaining enormous energy in the process before striking a phosphor screen that glowed wherever they landed. The image that resulted was faint light, converted into a much brighter one, displayed as a ghostly monochrome green picture of a world the naked eye could not see at all, and the effect could be layered. By chaining several of these intensifying stages together, one feeding its amplified output into the next, engineers could multiply the effect enormously, turning a whisper of ambient light into an image bright enough for a soldier to aim a rifle by. The device did not create light where none existed. It found light that was already there, scattered so thin across the darkness that no human eye could ever have used it. And it gathered that scattered light back together into something a man could finally see by. Picture the actual difference in what two men standing in the exact same field would experience. Thun, looking out across the open ground, sees nothing. Total uniform black, no shape, no depth, no distinction between the earth and the sky above it. An American soldier looking through the scope at the exact same field in the exact same instant sees something else entirely. A grainy, green-tinted world with real shapes in it. The tree line resolved into individual trunks, the open ground showing its own faint texture. And somewhere in that texture, a shape that does not belong to the grass or the earth, moving low and slow in a way that grass never moves. Same field, same photons arriving from the same sky. Two completely different experiences of what that darkness actually contained. Before going further, it is worth being precise about a limitation of this device, because the honest, technical truth is more interesting than the simpler myth that grew up around it, and it explains something important about why it works so devastatingly well anyway. The device could not see in a true and complete absence of light. If every source of ambient illumination were somehow eliminated entirely, the device would have shown its operator nothing at all. No sky glow, no distant light of any kind. An environment truly and perfectly free of photons, the device had nothing to amplify in that case. This is why American soldiers called it, from the very start, the Starlight Scope, a name that was itself a piece of quiet, technical honesty. It needed starlight, or moonlight, or the residual glow of a cloudy sky, some trace of ambient light to work with. It was not magic. It was addition performed on a quantity of light so small that no unaided human eye could register it at all. But here's the crucial point. The one that made this technical limitation almost irrelevant on the actual battlefields of that war. True, complete, total absence of light, the kind the device genuinely could not work in, almost never occurred outdoors, anywhere on Earth, even on the darkest and most overcast nights. There was always something. The faint scatter of starlight through cloud. The last trace of atmospheric glow. Enough scattered photons, however few, for the device to seize upon and amplify. The nights that felt like absolute blackness to a man like Thon, nights he and every soldier before him had trusted completely as the safest possible cover, were, in the strict physical sense that mattered to this device, never actually dark at all. They only felt that way to an eye that had never been built to see what was really there. This is the gap the entire story lives inside, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the whole reason this weapon produced the specific, disorienting fear that it did. Thon's darkness and the scope's darkness were not the same thing, even though they looked identical to him. His eyes told him the field ahead was an impenetrable black, and every part of his training told him to trust that judgment completely because it had always been reliable before. The scope was reading the exact same field and finding it full of faint, usable light, more than enough to resolve the shape of a man moving low across open ground. Thon was not unlucky. He was operating on information that had simply stopped being true, updated by a piece of technology he did not know existed, and he had no way of knowing that the darkness protecting him was no longer the darkness it used to be. Turn the perspective around for a moment and picture the sentry on the other end of that shot, because his experience of the same night was strange in its own way. He had been staring through the scope for the better part of an hour, watching the same empty field resolve over and over into nothing worth reporting. His eyes had adjusted to the strange, grainy, green world the device showed him, a world with its own texture and its own kind of tedium, no more dramatic to him by that point than watching an ordinary road for traffic. And then something in that texture changed. A shape, low against the ground, moving with a slowness and a purpose that nothing natural in that field moved with. He did not need to understand image intensification or photocathodes or vacuum tubes to know what he was looking at. He only needed to trust the picture in front of him, which by then he had learned to trust completely and to do the job he had been trained to do. Now, return to the confusion that spread through the Viet Cong units after incidents like the one that killed Thon, because understanding why they could not explain it tells you something important about how thoroughly this technology broke the ordinary rules of nighttime warfare. A scout's entire craft, in any army, in any era before this one, depended on a shared and reliable understanding of what darkness meant for both sides equally. If a moonless, overcast night was dark for you, it was dark for your enemy too, and that mutual blindness was the single most dependable fact of night operations. It was the foundation on which an entire tradition of nighttime infiltration and ambush had been built for as long as armies had fought at night at all. A skilled scout learned to read exactly how dark a given night was, to judge how close he could approach undetected, to calibrate his risk against conditions he understood because they applied equally to everyone on that field. This technology broke that shared foundation completely, and it broke it invisibly without any outward sign that anything at all had changed. Think about what this actually did to a scout's judgment in the field. Thong looked at the sky before he moved, the same way every careful scout had always looked at the sky, checking for moon, for stars, for any hint of light that might expose him. He found none, and by every rule that had ever kept men like him alive, that absence of visible light meant safety. He had no way to know that the rules had quietly changed because nothing about the night itself had changed. The stars were exactly as dim as they always were. The moon was exactly as absent as it always was. The only thing that had changed was sitting in an American position he could not see, converting the same faint light he was ignoring into a clear enough picture to kill him from 300 meters. And this is precisely why the reports that filtered back to other units made no sense to the men receiving them. A survivor could describe what had happened. No flare, no warning light, a single accurate shot out of total darkness, but he could not explain the mechanism because he did not know it existed. Without an explanation, the reports read less like combat intelligence and more like ghost stories, and they traveled through the ranks the way ghost stories always do, gaining a kind of dread that outran the actual facts because fear fills in whatever gap explanation leaves behind. Think about how quickly an unexplained danger multiplies once it starts traveling by word of mouth. One death becomes a rumor. The rumor becomes a warning, repeated at every campfire, growing a little stranger and a little more frightening with each retelling, because nobody correcting it has the facts to correct it with. Within weeks, men who had never come anywhere near an actual starlight scope were treating ordinary dark nights with a superstitious caution that had nothing to do with any specific danger they could name. The fear had outrun the weapon itself, spreading further and faster than the actual technology ever could, because an unexplained death is a story that tells itself, filling in whatever blanks fear finds most convincing. Some units began treating certain kinds of darkness with a suspicion they could not justify with any specific reasoning, avoiding open ground at night even when there was no rational tactical explanation available to them beyond an accumulated, unexplained sense that darkness itself had stopped being reliable. This is the particular cruelty of a genuinely secret technology, deployed without any way for the other side to learn what it actually was. The Viet Cong could not develop a countermeasure against a threat they could not name. They could not train their scouts to watch for a specific warning sign, because there was no warning sign to watch for. All they had was a growing, formless dread about darkness that had once been their most reliable ally, and no framework at all for understanding why it had begun, without explanation, to betray them. Picture a unit commander weeks after Thon's death trying to brief his own scouts on what had happened, because the scene reveals exactly how helpless the lack of explanation actually left them. He can describe the facts precisely enough: a moonless night, an open field, a single accurate shot with no warning. He cannot answer the question every man in front of him is asking with his eyes, which is simply how. He offers the only theories available to him. Perhaps a listening device had somehow detected footsteps. Perhaps a very lucky sentry had simply been staring in the right direction at the right moment. None of these explanations feel adequate, and he knows it as he says them, because none of them account for the specific, total accuracy of a single shot delivered with no illumination and no apparent warning at all. His scouts leave that briefing with a new caution and no new knowledge, which is precisely the situation the secrecy around the technology was designed to produce. The secrecy surrounding this technology was not incidental. It was deliberate. And understanding exactly how deliberate it was explains why the confusion on the other side lasted as long as it did. The device was treated from its earliest deployment as a piece of genuinely sensitive military technology, and the American military built real procedures around keeping it that way. Units that carried it were required to sign it out formally and account for its return, a level of tracking not applied to ordinary rifle equipment, specifically to minimize the chance that one might be lost, abandoned, or captured intact. This was not excessive caution for its own sake. The value of the technology depended entirely on the enemy not understanding it existed, and the moment a working unit fell into enemy hands, that value began to erode, because a captured device could eventually be studied, understood, and countered. Think about what a captured scope would have actually told the other side if one had ever reached a technical facility for study the way we saw happen with captured radios and captured weapons elsewhere in the series. It would have revealed the entire mechanism at once: the photocathode, the intensification stages, the phosphor screen, and with that mechanism understood, countermeasures become possible. you can learn to move in ways that minimize your visible profile against amplified ambient light. You can time movements to genuinely dark conditions, distinguishing them from conditions that only look dark to an unaided human eye. You can develop your own version of the same technology, given time and the right industrial support. None of this was available to Than's side for a long stretch of the war, precisely because the Americans understood exactly how much of this weapon's value depended on the other side never getting the chance to take one apart on a workbench. The device's practical limitations, ironically, helped preserve the secrecy longer than a more convenient piece of equipment might have. It was heavy, several pounds of glass and electronics that made it impractical to carry on long mobile patrols, which meant it saw its heaviest use in static, defensive positions. A base perimeter, a listening post, a fixed point where its weight did not matter because the men using it were not moving far. This meant the device was most often used exactly where American forces had the most control over their own security, reducing the chances of exactly the kind of chaotic, fast-moving engagement in which equipment gets lost or abandoned. The very awkwardness that made it a poor patrol weapon made it a genuinely well-protected secret for years. Picture the actual sign-out procedure a soldier went through before carrying one of these devices out to a perimeter position, because the ritual itself tells you how seriously the Americans took the risk of capture. A serial number logged, a name attached to that serial number, a specific accounting at the end of the shift that the same device with the same serial number had come back intact. This was not the casual treatment given to an ordinary piece of gear that could be replaced with a requisition form. It was handled the way a military treats something it genuinely cannot afford to lose, and every man who carried one understood, without needing it spelled out, that losing this particular piece of equipment would be treated very differently than losing a rifle or a radio. The procedure itself was a constant, quiet reminder of exactly how much value the Americans placed on keeping this secret intact. And think about what would have actually happened if one had been lost anyway, in the chaos of an overrun position or a hasty withdrawal. It would not simply have been a piece of missing property. It would have represented a measurable, permanent erosion of an advantage the Americans had spent real effort protecting. And the loss would have been treated, investigated, and reported at a level far above what an ordinary piece of equipment would ever receive. That seriousness, built into the procedures around the device from the very beginning, is itself a measure of how completely both sides understood what was actually at stake in keeping the mechanism hidden. It would be too simple to end this story with an unbroken secret and an enemy left permanently in the dark, and the honest picture requires acknowledging both the real limits of the technology and the real, if gradual, erosion of the advantage it provided. The device's genuine limitations mattered, and they mattered more the longer the war went on. Its weight kept it largely out of the hands of mobile infantry on aggressive patrol, which meant a scout moving carefully, staying away from the fixed positions where the technology was concentrated, faced a meaningfully lower risk than the story of Than's death might suggest to someone hearing only the most dramatic version of it. The image it produced, however remarkable for its era, was a grainy, monochrome picture with real limits on range and resolution, not a perfect window into the dark. And its dependence on at least some ambient light, however small, meant that under the very darkest conditions, dense cloud cover with no residual sky glow at all, movement kept close beneath heavy jungle canopy that blocked even the faintest trace of starlight, the device's advantage narrowed considerably, sometimes to nothing at all. And over the long span of the war, the underlying secret did not and could not remain perfectly contained forever. Technology this significant, deployed at real scale across a long conflict, inevitably left traces. captured examples did eventually reach hands capable of studying them, whether through battlefield losses, the strict accounting procedures failed to fully prevent, or through allied nations sharing what they had learned. Broader awareness of the general principle behind image intensification technology spread. Gradually, through military circles on every side of the wider Cold War, the Vietnam conflict was embedded within, and the specific disorienting confusion that had killed men like Thon became, over years, a known and nameable threat rather than an inexplicable one. Picture how that knowledge actually traveled, because it rarely arrived in one dramatic moment. A captured device, examined patiently, its mechanism sketched and understood piece by piece, the way a captured radio's true vulnerability had once been found in a taped card rather than in its circuitry. A briefing pass between allied technical officers describing a general principle rather than a specific model, enough to explain the pattern without necessarily explaining how to replicate the device itself. A soldier's account, filtering back through channels far slower and far less certain than any American intelligence network, of a captured example that had been examined and at least partially understood. None of this happened quickly, and none of it fully closed the gap while the war was still being fought. But the accumulation, year after year, of fragments like these was enough to eventually turn an inexplicable horror into a known and, however imperfectly, plannable danger. This honest accounting matters because it keeps the story from becoming a simple tale of one side's total, uncounterable dominance in the dark. The technology bought a real and significant advantage for a real and significant stretch of the war, and it cost lives on the side that could not explain it. It was never a permanent, unbreakable secret, because no significant military technology used at scale over years in a war involving multiple great powers watching closely from the sidelines ever stays a secret forever. The genuine achievement here was not permanent invisibility. It was buying years of decisive advantage before the rest of the world eventually caught up. The men who served alongside Than and the wider Viet Cong intelligence apparatus that eventually pieced together what had actually happened on nights like his carried away a lesson that went beyond this one piece of equipment, and it is worth understanding what that lesson actually was. They came to understand, once the general principle behind the technology finally became known, that they had not been defeated by any failure of their own courage or skill or judgment. Than had done everything a well-trained scout was supposed to do. He had read the sky correctly by every standard that had applied to every night before that one. His death was not a lesson in what he had done wrong. It was a lesson in how completely a piece of technology, invisible and unexplained, could rewrite the rules of an entire domain of warfare without a single visible sign that anything had changed. This realization, once it finally arrived, produced a specific and lasting caution that shaped how these units approached darkness for the rest of the war. Once the general principle of image intensification became understood, even imperfectly, scouts began treating nights that looked completely dark with a wariness they had never needed before, because they now understood that the darkness they could see was not necessarily the darkness that mattered. This was, in its own way, a form of adaptation, imperfect, built on incomplete information for a long stretch of the war, but real, and it changed how a generation of scouts approached the one thing they had once trusted more than almost anything else in their entire craft. Picture what this partial adaptation actually looked like in practice, once enough scattered fragments of understanding had reached the men doing the work. A scout planning a night crossing began factoring in something he had never had to consider before. Not simply whether the sky was dark to his own eyes, but whether the position he was approaching was the kind of fixed, defended point where the Americans concentrated their rare and precious equipment. He learned to treat static perimeters and known listening posts with a heightened caution that had nothing to do with visible light at all. avoiding the specific kinds of ground where this invisible threat was most likely to be waiting, even on nights that looked, by every old rule he had ever trusted, perfectly safe to cross. It was not a full solution. It was a hedge built on partial knowledge, and it saved some lives that the old rules applied blindly would not have saved. And there was a deeper, more unsettling lesson buried inside the specific one, something that outlasted the war and the technology both. An enemy who understands something about the physical world that you do not yet understand can defeat you without ever fighting you in any way you would recognize as a fair contest of skill or courage. Thon was not outfought. He was outknown by men who understood a fact about darkness that he had no way to access, and there is a particular quiet horror in that kind of defeat that no amount of personal bravery could have ever answered, because the battle had already been decided invisibly before either side ever fired a shot. Here is what Thon's death, and the confusion that followed it, actually revealed, and why it matters more than one tragic night on one dark field. For the entire history of warfare before this technology existed, darkness was the great equalizer, the one condition that applied to both sides of any conflict equally and without exception. If you could not see your enemy could not see you either, and an entire tradition of nighttime infiltration, ambush, and movement had been built on that simple, reliable, mutual blindness. The Americans did not defeat that principle by becoming braver in the dark, or more skilled at moving through it. They defeated it by discovering that the darkness itself had never been as complete as everyone on both sides had always assumed, and by building a device patient enough to find the faint, scattered light that had been there all along, waiting to be gathered. That is the real meaning behind the fear this weapon produced, and why the men who faced it could not simply outthink their way to a solution the way they had outthought so many other American advances in that long war. You can develop tactics against a weapon you understand. You can adapt to a threat you can name. What you cannot easily do is adapt to a fact about the physical world you do not yet know exists. And for a real and significant stretch of that war, the difference between what Thon's eyes told him and what was actually true about the light on that field was a gap that killed men who had done absolutely nothing wrong by every standard they had ever been trained to trust. And notice, finally, what this teaches about the deepest kind of advantage one side can hold over another. In any contest, in any era, it is not always the biggest weapon or the most soldiers or the most territory that decides an engagement. Sometimes it is simply understanding something true about the world, a fact of physics, patient and quiet, sitting unexploited until someone finally builds the device that can use it, while your enemy is still operating on an older, comfortable, and suddenly incomplete version of the truth. This is true far beyond one field, one scope, one war. Every advantage anyone has ever held over an unsuspecting rival has at its root come down to exactly this shape: one side understanding something true that the other side has not yet discovered, or has discovered too late to matter. The weapon changes, the war changes, the specific fact of physics or chemistry or human behavior being exploited changes from one conflict to the next, but the underlying pattern repeats quietly across the whole of military history, and it will keep repeating for as long as one side can find a truth about the world before the other side does. Then trusted the darkness completely, the way every soldier before him had trusted it, because it had never once given him reason not to. On that field, on that night, the darkness was not what he believed it to be, and by the time anyone understood why, it was far too late for the lesson to help him. Now you know why the scouts could never explain it. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping. Not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, invisible advantages that decided who came home from the dark on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a scout, a sniper, a perimeter guard, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.